When discussing comic book artists, we instantly think of great talents like Jim Lee, Alex Ross, Greg Capullo, and others. Artists who have redefined, each in their own way, the way we think about superheroes. These are people we admire because we recognize their great skill and importance in comics, so we often wait to see them at conventions to get a photo, a signature, or even a sketch. But if there are such skilled and talented people, why are there bad artists who also have work? Can't companies just hire good artists and that's it? I'm talking about well-known artists frequently slammed on social media for creating art that many find unappealing. Everyone has their own opinion, but when I asked my Instagram community about this topic, 3 names stood out. Rob Liefeld, John Romita Jr., and Frank Miller. But the real question here is, are all of them bad artists? Or is there something that we as viewers are not understanding? That's what we're going to analyze in this video, and to do it, I'll have the help of my friend Rulo Valdez, who has worked as a professional artist on comics like Batman the World, Spider-Man, and Kanek Jr., and will help me understand this issue from the artist's point of view. We will also speak with Guadalupe Nuno, a non-verbal language expert, to grasp the significance of images in comic book storytelling. My name is Go, the Geek Monitor, and today we are going to take on the bad artists and
very.
To fully understand the topic, we first have to ask ourselves what makes a good comic book artist. We need to start with this question. What's more important for a comic, having a good artist or having a good writer? This is what was recently asked to the artist Todd McFarlane, who is a legend in the industry for his work on comics like Spider-Man or Spawn, a character he co-created. And far from giving a politically correct answer like no, both are very important, I couldn't put one above the other, he said this: "It's logical that he's taken a sales-oriented approach since Todd, besides being a great artist, is known for his business acumen, founding companies like Image Comics and McFarlane Toys." He has a point. Comics are highly visual, which is why the drawing has great weight within the stories. However, this answer needs to be complemented. It's not that writers are less important, but artists play a fundamental role in narrating the stories. Even with a written script, they often decide the pace, perspective, and overall mood conveyed on each page. This varies depending on the creative team. But if there is no good writer or no writer at all, the artist takes the reins of the story's narration. Some artists excel at it while others struggle, but hey, they leave a coherent story. However, it's something that a writer could hardly do. But hey, share your thoughts in the comments. The point here is that we usually think that to be a great comic artist, the only requirement is to be able to draw very well. That is, having a great knowledge of topics such as perspective and anatomy, which will allow you to create these beautiful illustrations. And that's why if you want to be a comic artist, you take drawing classes. But there's a problem with this.
In something that is important to clarify is that, especially in Mexico, it's very difficult to learn to draw comics because those who already know how to draw comics and work in this field generally don't have time to teach.
Oftentimes, those who teach comics have never worked in the industry. So that's also an important point because oftentimes comic classes are actually drawing classes.
To clarify, taking drawing classes is perfectly fine and can indeed be helpful. However, if we stick with this idea that it's the only skill you need, you can have a limited view of the subject. It's that the comic
covers many things, of which knowing how to draw or having a drawing standard is just the first step in a huge 500-mile career.
Knowing how to narrate is crucial, don't you think?
Knowing how to narrate and apply color is key.
And then once you apply the color, how you apply the texts, and then once you learn what post-production is like.
This means that a great comic artist does much more than just draw. First off, they have to be very good at telling stories graphically, something not everyone can do even if they can draw very well. Because it's not the same to draw a static image, no matter how good it is, as it is to be able to interestingly distribute a story over a certain number of pages and also do it in a short period of time, as many artists work against the clock. I remember that.
One of my first assignments at Marvel was to complete 7 pages in 3 days.
So obviously you don't come out with the same quality. Obviously you don't get things done with the same vigor.
Another factor that we also need to take into account to understand why we like some artists more than others has to do with artistic trends, as in each era there are certain aesthetic canons that are more popular than others. That is, a certain type of visual style that we readers find more attractive. A great comic artist then must be able to identify or even impose these trends. For example, for many years, John Romita Sr. was the aesthetic standard to follow at Marvel, while Neil Adams at some point set a standard within DC Comics. However, a first major reference in the canons of Western comics can be found in Hal Foster, who is known for his work on comics like Tarzan and the
Prince Valiant. Hal Foster seems to me like one of the first ones that everyone wanted to draw like him, right? I mean, he established certain standards of anatomy, certain standards of stroke, and there is a certain aesthetic that we can appreciate, which is what set the trend for at least the first 30 years of comics. I mean, and all the artists who wanted to work on a mainstream title had to draw as similar to this style as possible in order to make their projects very commercial. Also, something that I find very beautiful and very particular is that he also set the canon, so to speak, of male beauty. Because if you notice, I mean, that face is Bruce Wayne or Superman any day of the week.
What's the problem with these aesthetic standards? We often mistakenly think that popular comic book styles are the only valid ones. Interestingly, the styles that gain popularity, such as those of Jim Lee, John Romita Sr., and Hal Foster, usually have a degree of anatomical realism. It's the anatomically realistic styles that become popular. Why does this happen? Probably anatomically realistic ones become popular. Why does this happen? It probably has to do with the way we think about art.
Let's experiment. Quick, think about art.
Tell me the name of the first great painter that comes to your mind.
You probably thought of names like Leonardo da Vinci or Michelangelo.
Because we are used to seeing them as great masters of art who made extremely realistic works. And yes, of course, they are great masters. However, we are used to thinking that the most realistic is the best art, and this is not a rule. And contrary to what we currently think, realism is not the goal of art, nor has it always been the intention. Do these Greek paintings aim to reflect realism in your opinion? I used to think they painted like that because they didn't know how to paint any other way. But then you start comparing them with Greek statues from similar periods and you realize that these vessels were fully intended to be this way. Going back to comics, what is anatomically most accurate is not always the best. And as an example, we have to talk about Jack Kirby. If you analyze Jack Kirby's art, you'll immediately notice that the anatomical proportions of his drawings or the perspective often weren't correct. However, it's undeniable that panels like this feel like an explosion of narrative energy. And as incredible as it may seem, in his disproportions there is a dynamism that makes each of the characters seem to come out of the pages.
Jack Kirby was a master at storytelling, but not only in writing them, but also in his way of narrating through illustrations.
Jack in each drawing made elements like power or technology feel more real than ever, which transported readers to cosmic and fantastic worlds. So together with Stan Lee, he co-created several of the most iconic characters in comic book history. However, his peculiar style was not to everyone's taste. And when he went to work for DC Comics, the company corrected the faces of some of Kirby's drawings as they did not align with the aesthetic standards they were used to. I'm sure that DC regrets making that decision today. But this tells us about how often we people are so married to a certain type of aesthetic that we think anything that deviates from this norm is ugly. If it happened to a legend like Jackie Kirby, it can happen to anyone. For example, I don't think Frank Miller is a bad artist. It's true Frank Miller is one of the most criticized comic artists in history, despite creating gems like 300 and The Dark Knight Returns. And many fans think that as an artist, he's a great writer. I understand the perspective, but I don't agree with it. Since his characters often are rough and seem to completely lack anatomical principles. But did you know that Frank Miller started with a much more friendly style? If you take a look at his early works, you'll realize that they align much more with what we regularly consider aesthetic. Which tells us that this drawing style he is known for is a product of his decisions, not his shortcomings. In other words, he chooses to draw like this. But why? Because just like other artists like Jack Kirby, Miller found that to be usual. He puts expression above the usual accuracy. He puts expression above accuracy and decided that these angular lines and rough shadings were a better vehicle for telling his stories. That is, can you imagine The Dark Knight Returns in a style like Jim Lee's? I can't. I feel that style was exactly the right one to tell that story. In fact, if you want to see Frank Miller at 100% of his artistic capacity, just take a look at these panels from Sin City, where his minimalist black and white strokes focus on highlighting the rawness of the story and the tormented emotions of his characters.
Panels like this one of Marvel in the Rain or this crime being committed within an onomatopoeia speak to the great creativity that Frank Miller had when using few elements to convey an extremely powerful and captivating message.
For me then, Frank Miller was undoubtedly one of the greats.
It's not the only case of an artist who changed their style over time to give more emphasis to expressiveness than to realism.
Outside of comics, a very emblematic case is that of Pablo Picasso, who as the years went by moved further and further away from realism. It's also true that factors like age started to affect not only Frank Miller's drawing style but his writing style as well.
So he is currently heavily criticized for illustrations like this one, which I personally don't like either, and for his new stories which don't seem to have the same impact as before.
Another artist who is heavily criticized and who I personally don't like is John Romita Jr.
We were saying it's very funny how die-hard comic fans don't like the art of John Romita Jr. And I was saying that to me, John Romita Jr. seems to be an artist for artists, because something that Romita Jr. is widely recognized for in the industry, I mean in the editorial industry.
He is one of the fastest and most diligent artists, producing very good comics by industry standards. Now again, the aesthetics may not be liked, the proportions may not be liked, his anatomy may not be liked, but the idea behind the illustration is an incredible idea. I mean, you're getting something super cool. I mean, you see a Batman who is super hurt, you see this chainsaw he's carrying as a weapon, and you get this feeling like it's the last journey of these two, right?
So the cross at the top, right?
So he's an artist who telegraphs too clearly the intention of what he's trying to convey.
But well, let's go.
When discussing famous artists known for drawing ugly, the controversial and emblematic case of Rob Liefeld often comes to mind, don't you think? It's likely that you do, as he has been one of the most criticized artists in the community for years due to infamous works like this Captain America.
I don't like it either, but certain characteristics must be acknowledged.
The costumes of his characters are so impractical to the point that so many belts look ridiculous.
His writing style appears mature but reflects the education of an elementary schooler. He can't draw feet, his perspective is ugly, it seems like he's never seen a woman beyond porn pages.
And his characters have the emotional depth of a puddle.
And then?
And then what?
Weren't you going to say something good about him? Yes. Beyond my personal tastes, you have to recognize that Rob Liefeld understood the comic trend that was happening in the 90s, and he brilliantly exploited this edgy and violent aesthetic that readers wanted to see. In fact, if you look at his early work, you'll realize that his style was much softer than what it eventually became. Why did he change his style? He realized that edgier content resonated better with the audience, boosting his comic sales at Marvel. This allowed him to rival artists with superior technical skills, like Todd McFarlane, in terms of sales.
Today, many people wonder how Liefeld came to occupy this status of legendary artist that he has today.
But I think he is a very good example of how a great comic artist should have different skills. Unfortunately or fortunately, not all of these have to do with drawing.
These days, these 90s Liefeld-style designs may seem horrible to us, but in their time, they certainly did feel like a breath of fresh air. A step in another direction that moved away from the traditional aesthetic and even set a trend at the time. And the fact that this message can be conveyed visually is very important, particularly in comics.
That is, have you noticed that there are several comics that have little text and many images? In fact, in The Big Bang Theory, they even make a joke about this.
How did they finish so quickly?
It's because it had a lot of drawings and one page only said Bracadum Dumim.
Less text does not mean a bad story. It means that a large part of the message is transmitted non-verbally.
Illustrators must be proficient in a specific type of language.
But what does this mean?
Basically, communication is divided into two types of language. What is called verbal language and non-verbal language. Verbal language is the words we choose to use. And non-verbal language is everything that accompanies those words and helps us make sense of communication.
In the case of comics, where we can have complete stories without a single text, non-verbal communication is very important, because this is how the artist managed to convey to us how the characters feel and their attitude towards each situation without the need to write a single word.
It's better understood with an example. In this panel from the Spawn comic, we see the hands or arms of different characters coming out of a cage while the character watches them in surprise. We can recognize who these characters are even though we only see a fraction of each one's body by the colorimetry, by some specific features that we assign to these characters and with which we identify them or by some element even in the posture and body language of these characters.
In other words, we recognize each of these arms by elements such as color or even pose, as is the case with this arm of Spider-Man, which we would surely recognize even if he didn't have his suit due to the typical pose.
And Superman's arm, which is probably one of the most interesting because it's the only one making a closed fist. The closed fist in this specific context is telling us about the character's will to fight.
All these elements are used by a good artist consciously or unconsciously to effectively convey their message. Finally, the idea of this video is not to tell you that X artist is bad or that you have to like Frank Miller or John Romita Jr. by force. Rather, what I wanted was to show you that great artists do much more than just draw, and that there are many skills that are very useful for someone to excel in this medium. There are artists who are capable of reinventing the way we see superheroes. There are others who are excellent at telling stories visually. And there are others who use a very specific visual language to be completely expressive when telling a story. But there are also other great artists who excel in some qualities that may not have so much to do with the artistic.
They may be highly efficient and fast at telling a story within a set time frame.
Perhaps they are artists who manage to identify trends, or perhaps they are great business minds. All of this paints a much more complete picture where now we are not only going to focus on the quality of the drawing to know if an artist is a good comic artist or not, but on many other aspects. Which helps us to have a much more informed opinion if you want to see the full interviews with Rulo Valdez and Wada. In addition to many other videos about the history of comics and lives, I tell you that these are in the section for channel members. I'm going to leave you a link down here in case you're interested in subscribing, as well as Rulo and Wada's networks. That's all for today. I'm Gu, and keep looking beyond the obvious.